Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining me for this episode of The Unlovely Truth. I'm your host, Lori Morrison, and it's time to talk about what happens at the intersection of faith and true crime. I'm also going to share with you ways that you can make a leap from the audience to the action through service. Don't forget that some of our conversations may be difficult for young or sensitive listeners, but you and I are going to go ahead and dive right in. This is Season 2, Episode 24, and our book this week is Orange is the New Black. I had no idea that the hit Netflix series was based on a book, and a true crime book at that. Just for you, I've put a link in the show notes so you can buy a copy and not miss any of the action from the book. My guest today is James Early, a fellow podcaster and a volunteer in prison ministry. James actually serves at the same prison that is the setting for most of the action in this week's book. You'll be fascinated by how his work there changed his life. But first, let's recap author Piper Kerman's experiences and what she learned from spending a year in federal custody. Serving time is a great social leveler. Piper Kerman's upper-class education and solid family life couldn't protect her from the consequences of a foolish desire for adventure that ended up with her delivering a suitcase full of drug money across international borders. Even after she settled into a more conventional post-college life, that mistake would rear its ugly head just when she had the most to lose. After leaving her drug smuggling friends behind, Piper began to build a career and figure out what she wanted her life to look like. She met a man who was nothing like what she thought she wanted, but was everything she needed. Then, one day, law enforcement officers arrived at their apartment wanting to see Piper. They were from Customs, and they had come to let Piper know that she had been indicted on money laundering and drug smuggling charges. What she'd done years ago didn't seem adventurous anymore, just reckless. Her family and boyfriend hadn't known what she'd done, and now here they were stuck helping her deal with the consequences of her actions. Consequences that ended up with Piper pleading guilty and being sentenced to 15 months in a federal prison. Her college degree certainly didn't prepare her for strip searches and a complete lack of privacy, or seeing elderly inmates whose crime was taking phone messages for their young male relatives. The food was stereotypically awful, but she did learn how to make what was called prison cheesecake. Navigating all the strange rules that come with being in prison would have been overwhelming if kind prisoners hadn't reached out to befriend Piper, like Annette with her mother hen instincts, or Nina with her street smarts. Piper loved doing yoga with Sister Ardith, a nun who was serving time for a nonviolent protest. Even though Piper wasn't particularly religious, she grew to appreciate what faith did for some of her fellow prisoners, like Rose. Rose was who you went to for a pedicure, which gave her lots of time to chat with her customers. She shared with Piper that the biggest thing she learned about her faith in prison was how much she had to give to others. Piper lived for visits with her family and her now fiancé, who, once the initial shock of her past felonious activities had faded, continued to support her. It was a stark contrast to some of the women around her who would have no similar soft landing when they were released. Some had been there so long that Piper feared for them once they no longer had the structure of the institution or a healthy family on the outside. Working in ministry to women who are incarcerated has been an amazing experience for me. Your church may already have a ministry in your local jail, but if not, contact local police or your sheriff to see how you can get involved. You can also ask them if there are any organizations that serve women once they're released and need support as they transition back to life on the outside. Now let's get back to Piper's story. Piper couldn't help but notice the social issues that surrounded her in prison. So many of her fellow prisoners were poor and lacked an adequate education. The only programs provided by her prison, with even a small amount of success, was drug rehab and the GED classes. In the neighborhoods these ladies came from and would return to, the underground economy of drug sales was almost the only economy there was. Of course, a GED wasn't exactly a ticket to a wonderful life. Good jobs are hard to find when you have a felony on your record. But just like a better education can help you earn more on the outside, it makes a world of difference on the inside as well. Piper's roommate, Miss Natalie, was the head baker in the prison kitchen. Because she lacked a high school diploma, Miss Natalie only made $5.60 a week for 40 hours of hard work. That meant that she barely earned enough to buy toothpaste and soap from the prison commissary. I was shocked to learn that in Piper's prison anyway, the only cleaning items provided to prisoners for free was laundry soap. Everything else had to be bought from the prison at prices set by the prison. So there was a lot of excitement when the GED test results came back. Miss Natalie had taken the test many times and had always been tripped up by that math section. But not this time. This time she passed, earning her coveted GED and a little bit more money to spend in the prison commissary. Work was important in prison as a way to pass time without going crazy. Some roles were more in demand than others, like the puppy program, which is pretty much what it sounds like. Prisoners trained service dogs, and the perk was that they got to keep those sweet balls of fluff in their cells with them. Piper learned the basics of being an electrician, and then transferred to the construction shop. One of her neighbors in her housing unit, nicknamed Pom Pom, worked in the garage. And that work assignment brought out what I thought was one of the most heartbreaking stories in the entire book. The boss in the garage called Pom Pom to his office one day to ask if she had had any relatives serve time at the prison. It turns out that Pom Pom's mother had worked for the boss in the garage years before. Everyone I've talked to in prison ministry has seen this intergenerational incarceration firsthand. And when members of your family have served time, it becomes almost normal and almost expected that you're on the same path. Piper asked Pom Pom where her mother was now. Pom Pom had no idea. As Piper's term drew to a close, she realized how fortunate she was. A friend who owned his own company created a job for her. No one else she had served time with had that. She had a fiancé with a home to live in. Many of her new friends would be released to homeless shelters. But her time in the Danbury Federal Correctional Institution also left its mark on Piper. Her grandmother died while she was incarcerated. After her release, Piper had several years of federal probation ahead of her. But she also had a new calling. She served on the board of the Women's Prison Association, a nonprofit that's been around since 1845. Her book, Orange is the New Black, also lists almost 36 organizations that work to help individuals impacted by incarceration. Check out the show notes for a link to buy the book, and maybe you'll find a group that needs you to get out of the audience and into the action through service. Now let's check in with today's guest, James Early, and listen to his stories from his years in prison ministry. And don't forget, check out the show notes for links to his website and his podcast, The Bible Speaks to You. Orange is the New Black was such a huge hit for HBO, and I just recently figured out that not only was it loosely based on a book, it was a true crime book at that. So, having recently gotten involved in doing some ministry work at my local jail, I was thrilled when I met you and heard about the many years of prison ministry work that you have done, and right there in the same prison that Piper Kerman served her time in. So, I want you to tell everybody listening about some of the things that you learned about the struggles people have when they're incarcerated.
Oh, wow, Lori. Hi, thanks. And it's great to be here. Just to let your listeners know, for 12 years, I did a daily Bible study at the prison, the Danbury Federal Correctional Institution. When I started back in October of 2008, it was a women's prison, a women's camp. And now they have men and women on two different places in the facility. I think one of the biggest surprises to me in working with people there on such a regular basis is that these are just regular people. They've done something wrong, but they're real people. They have feelings. They are intelligent sometimes. Sometimes they know a lot more than I do about a lot of things. And it's wonderful to get to know someone like that as a person and treat them as people that are important and of value. And they respond to that. I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned in that whole process is we're all God's children. We've all done things that are wrong. Sometimes people have crossed the line, and so they get in prison. But and sometimes they've been incarcerated unjustly, or at least they think they have. And sometimes it is true. But all those people I've worked with, the hundreds of people I've been with, I've come to appreciate them and value them, and I wish I could know them once they get out. And I've just made some really deep connections, although they're temporary. I feel like, wow, these are my brothers and sisters, and it's a beautiful, wonderful experience.
I love the story of how you even got involved in this ministry in the first place. So I want you to share that with everybody.
Well, that's pretty funny, actually. I was doing some office work for a lady who had started this ministry, this daily Bible study, and she was just kind of preparing for the future of when she might not be there because she was planning to move away from the area at some point. And she asked me probably about 2 or 3 years before I ended up starting, and I said, "Oh, no. I just didn't think that I would be ready to work with criminals," or I wasn't sure enough of myself of feeling like I could offer anything of value to them because, I was one of these guys that I never did drugs, I never did alcohol, I was kind of a straight-laced, at least on the outside, kind of a guy, and I didn't have these challenges that I would o that I had overcome that I felt like I could relate then with the people in prison that may have committed some of those kinds of, crimes and been caught and that sort of thing. So, I turned it down, but as I kept growing in my own spirituality and trying to follow Jesus more and, as we keep trying to do, about 3 or 4 years later, whenever it was, a friend called me. She's the person who had ended up helping this other lady who had started this ministry, and she asked me over the phone if I would be willing to do it. She said, "I prayed about it, and your name just kept coming to me." And I was at a point then when I said, "Oh, yeah, absolutely." It was such a right thing. I said, "Oh, I'll pray about it." But I already knew the answer in my heart. And of course, I did pray about it, and it was confirmed that it was the right thing for me to do. And so I started um, going out with her, and then I've been doing it by myself for probably about 11 years.
The ultimate Christian stall tactic. I'll pray about that.
Oh, I'll pray about it. Well, but in this case, it was like, yes. Oh, I'd say I'll pray about it just for to cover my bases. But it was a right step for me, and it's been such a learning experience. It's been a real humbling experience, and God has taught me so many things. But I've been able to help many other people in the process. So.
I'm sure there's a lot of people that don't even really understand why people like you and I believe it's important to minister to prisoners. Like you said, some of these people have done some pretty bad things. And so maybe in our minds, we think, well, they don't deserve our help. They don't deserve compassion. And I'm going to say that, aside from what we think scripture calls us to do, it's a very practical thing to help folks that are in prison because the vast majority of those people are going to serve their time and be released. And so we certainly want them coming out better than they were when they went in, right?
Yes, I mean, and so does the Bureau of Prisons. They have all kinds of programs, not just faith-based ones, that are trying to encourage people when they're released to be able to fit back into society because the recidivism is pretty high sometimes, and the more that they can reduce that, and it's wonderful to feel like you're making a difference. I know at least on a faith-based perspective, I've a lot of people have said to me, "Oh, Mr. Early, you have helped me regain my faith. You have restored my trust in God," or, and we just talk about the Bible. I'm not trying to whap them over their head with anything. But I give them a safe place to talk about their fears, their concerns, their issues, their past. We don't talk about their crimes so much, but the emotional baggage that they're carrying around, and I think it does make a difference, and that feels good because they look forward to getting out and making a difference. I know one lady that was in one of my Bible studies for a while. She's been released several years ago, and she has started a program to help women reorient themselves once they get out of prison.
Oh, that's awesome.
And she had that idea in prison. She shared it in the Bible class, and now she's doing it. So it does make a difference.
A quote about this book from the Los Angeles Times really resonates with me and basically said that the book was impossible to put down because Piper could have been any one of us. A questionable decision here, a bad friendship there, and we could end up going down a path that we never planned on walking. Did you see that among the prisoners that you worked with?
Yes, I did to some degree, and as I said, I didn't really get into what their crimes were. That was We were trained not to really do that because that's not what my function was, but sometimes it came up. Um, and what I noticed was that a lot of times people were either desperate and they did something they shouldn't have, or one step led to another, or somebody asked them to take a package for them somewhere, and they either knew or didn't know that it was drugs, that sort of thing. And sometimes they knew that they were doing something wrong, but they just couldn't help themselves, or they grew up in a culture where, oh, that's not so bad. And if you get caught, you get caught. I mean, there were all kinds of different things, but a lot of times people got caught in circumstances that they didn't know how to get out of. And the interesting thing is, a lot of times, especially, I worked more with the women than with the men because they just recently have had men back in the prison. But a lot of the women have said to me, I am so glad that I got arrested because it's given me a time to really examine my life in a way that I wouldn't have if I was still caught up in that previous lifestyle.
I hear that too.
Really?
Yes.
Well, I'm surprised at how often I hear that, but it does give them some time to reflect and think about the consequences of how they've lived or the culture they were in, and they wanna do something different with their lives, and, I mean, that's beautiful, and those are the kind of people, when they're coming to a Bible study, you can work with that, they're not rebelling against that, they really want to improve their lives, so I'm working with kind of a self-selected group of people that really want to make a difference and everything, and it's a joy to help those kind of people.
You mentioned being a pretty straight-laced type guy, and
Uh,
I was certainly very sheltered growing up. So listening to the backstories, if you will, of some of the women that I've met, the ones that have felt like sharing that, the things that they've dealt with in their lives are pretty eye-opening. At least they were to me. So whoever said that truth is stranger than fiction should have added that it's more heartbreaking as well.
oh, yeah.
And not to excuse what anybody that's been convicted of a crime has done, but did you meet people where you maybe heard some of that backstory and you thought, well, of course they ended up here?
Um, yes. Not only did I do my Bible study, once a week, several times the chaplain asked me to help facilitate a faith-based, reentry program called Threshold, and it was a 6-month program to help people on reentry back into society after they were released. And in this class, I did that 3 or 4 times. In this class, people did mention their crimes, and so you heard more of the backstory. My heart just went out to some of these people that grew up where they didn't know one or both parents, or their parents were drug addicts or drug dealers, or there was sexual, emotional, physical abuse in the home, and whatever problems I thought I had growing up and the mistakes my parents made, they were nothing compared to what some of these people were dealing with and what what they had to come face to face with. And this particular program, Threshold, actually allowed the inmates to do that and emotionally deal with some of that stuff in a way that they hadn't before, and there were some really wonderful breakthroughs there. But yeah, it just opened my eyes, as you said, opened my eyes to what I was unaware of that people were dealing with. And it made me so much more compassionate with them when you realize why somebody acts some way is they're just responding to the way they were treated. Maybe they never felt loved. They never had um, they never had enough of something growing up, and that affects us. And that's kind of hard to relate to when you haven't been there. But um, again, they're real people and they respond to love. When you treat them with respect, they they eventually open up and will respond to that. And that's been my experience anyway.
For me too, I think that a lot of the women that I've talked to, they have taken on that persona of a shameful person because that's what society has taught them. You've broken this rule, you've done this terrible thing, we're going to put you away from society because of that. And I've met several women that really internalize that. And so, I went into things thinking that I'm going to, help them kind of explore the scripture. And really, the best thing I can do for them, and you mentioned this earlier, is show them that they are worthy of being loved.
That's, I think, the most basic human need is to love and to be loved. That's where it all starts. And you can, share Bible verses until you're blue in the face or till somebody else is blue in the face listening. But if they don't feel your love, it doesn't really soak in. And I had a woman one time who had grown up in a church where she wasn't allowed to ask questions because that would be doubting your faith. And so she had all these really good, deep, we would call them theological questions about why this and why that. And so when she got into the Bible study, she sort of came in with a chip on her shoulder. You could sort of see it. And, but she asked these questions, and I loved the questions. They were the kind of questions I had years ago when I was in high school, when I was trying to make my faith my own. And so we would stop the class and we would all talk about these questions and I never told her what the answer was because we would just all share our perspectives. And I could say, you could answer this lots of different ways depending on how you think of God or how you see yourself. And back to this whole idea about how it's not just women, it's men too, how you see yourself. Some of that's society, but some of that is some pretty oppressive religious teachings that you're a miserable sinner. And yeah, sure, we have all sinned. I'm not going to ignore that. But Jesus also said to a crowd of sinners, "You're the light of the world." And so I kind of point those things out to people. I said, "This is what Jesus has said to just normal, regular people like you and me." And so over time, I think people start to feel I'm treating them with respect, they're feeling loved, and then they can hear the message and how it relates to them. And we do talk a lot about how do you see yourself? How has society conditioned you to see yourself? Is that really who you are? And one thing a lot of times I say is when they're having trouble loving themselves or loving someone else, I say, one of the things I say anyway is, well, imagine that that other person or you yourself, you're just a little baby, a week old. You haven't done anything wrong yet. You're just a beautiful package of joy. And could you love that? Could you love that person or could you love yourself that way? And they admit, yeah, well, okay, okay. Oh, well, I said, let's go back and just love that little baby. Start there because that's who you really are, that true, innocent purity that God created in his image and likeness. And I think a lot of the work I have done, a lot of times comes back to them learning to see themselves through God's eyes as his dear child. And, in the process, that helps me see myself better that way too.
It's amazing. I learn, or I feel like I learn more than I teach.
Oh, it's true. It's true. And sometimes, as I said, there was this one guy, one of the classes I was doing with the men. I mean, this guy was a Bible scholar. He knew Hebrew, and he had this Hebrew Bible, and we were in the Old Testament talking about all the angels in the Old Testament. He would bring up the translation of this particular word, and I learned so much. Um, and it was a joy. It was a wonderful time to realize I'm not the expert. I'm just one of you guys sitting here, and we're going to learn together. So, yeah.
Well, you are also a podcast host. And so I want you to share with us what you talk about, what your goals are for your podcast, and any new projects that you've got in the works.
Oh, wow. Well, my podcast is called The Bible Speaks to You. You can find it at thebiblespeakstoyou.com, and I hope you'll subscribe if you'd like to. Um, my focus really is getting back to the original spiritual teachings of Jesus, and not just the words, but actually putting into practice what he told us to do, because he said, it's not just enough to call me Lord. You have to do the will of my Father, which is in heaven. So, what does it mean to really love your neighbor as yourself? What does it really mean to be a peacemaker? What does it really mean to love your enemies and pray for them?
Oh, that's
The
a tough one.
Yeah, it is tough, but when you do that, the times that I've been able to really pull that off in my heart, it's such a wonderful freedom to forgive, to really forgive someone to where you just love them so much. That's what I'm interested in. I love to tell people, I love a good theological conversation. I don't like a debate. That doesn't, nobody wins a debate, but I love to talk about theological things. But to me, real theology is putting into practice God's love, following and obeying Jesus in your daily life. And that's what I'm trying to get out on my podcast. My most recent focus has been on getting into the mindset of Jesus. How did he see things? How did he think? What was his mental, spiritual process going on when he was out, talking to people, healing people, doing all the things he did? Because he said that if we believe in him, we can do the same things he did. Well, I think we have to start with we have to think the way he did. We have to look at things from his perspective. And I've I've this is where I am right now. I feel that his perspective on life was that what he started his ministry with, that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I don't think we've really even scratched the surface on what that means. We say that a lot, kind of like, oh, well, you're made in the image and likeness of God. And then we move on because we don't really know what it means. But I think the more we dwell with those ideas, I think that's why he healed so rapidly and so instantly, because he knew that in the kingdom of heaven, he said of Jairus's daughter that everybody else said was dead, he said, she's not dead. Well, in the kingdom of heaven, there is no death. And I think he brought that sense of heaven's presence to bear in everything he said and did, and it appeared. And it looked to us like it was a healing, that the girl came back to life, but to him, she never was dead because she was an eternal spiritual image and likeness of God. I mean, we get kind of deep here, but so that's kind of what I'm trying to focus on in my podcast is helping people discover who they are as God's dear child made in his image, that God's love and forgiveness and healing power are here right now just as much as they were 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago or whenever. Um, and whatever projects I'm working on, let's see. I've got a couple of books in me that are not really done yet. I wrote one, but it's too long, and I've got to work on it. So I've got those kind of things. I'm actually thinking about teaching some classes or doing some coaching on this whole Jesus mindset thing, because I think too often, and I juxtapose that with the Adam mindset. You know, the the difference between the first man Adam and the last man Adam, the old man and the new man, as Paul talks about the old self and the new self, the material approach to life. You're a miserable sinner. God doesn't love you enough to heal you, blah, 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 as opposed to the Jesus mindset is God loves you. He's here right now. He always is ready to help and heal you and you know, everything. So, that's kind of where I'm heading. And I don't know how that's gonna look, but, uh, we need to be more like Jesus. We say we love Jesus and we follow him, but then we keep holding on to our way of things. I mean, I do it too.
Oh,
Uh,
sure. And
well,
I love the way you have called it the Jesus mindset, because to me, even though this started out with great intentions, the little WWJD bracelets and what would Jesus do
right.
kind of became trite. It was something to say, and it was maybe a reminder that we should reflect a little bit before we said something snarky or did something that we shouldn't do. But really, and yeah, that's where I fail. So maybe I do need one of those bracelets. But the idea of trying to actually make my mindset be that of Jesus, that's revolutionary.
It really is, and Paul says in, I think it's 1 Corinthians 2:16 or 13, whatever, "We have the mind of Christ." Okay, then maybe we should use it? Uh, maybe maybe we have these things available to us and we don't employ them enough. I think getting back to what Jesus started his ministry was that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The next thing he said was, and that to me was the good news. Usually people talk about the gospel in this post crucifixion resurrection sense of Jesus on the cross and all that stuff, but really the gospel, the good news was Jesus said, I've got some great news, and it's the fact that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, but you'll never be able to see it or experience or participate unless you repent. And that word repent, metanoia in Greek means to completely think about things in a new way from a different perspective, to change your thinking, to think in a new way. And to me, that is quit thinking about things from a man-based, earth-based, materialistic-based perspective to the perspective of what's going on in the kingdom of heaven right now. And you think, and I think, and we've all been told it's way off in the future after we die. That's when we get to heaven. Jesus said, no, 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 no. I've got good news. It's here right now. You just can't see it with your eyeballs or hear it with your ears. It's a spiritual thing that God reveals, but it's present. And I think that's the the mindset shift that we need to take. And then it's not like we're trying to force something, but if you start looking at things from a different perspective, you will see things differently.
Well, and that brings us full circle to where we started. Jesus mentioned in scripture that he almost assumed that people would be visiting others in prison, because he mentioned that when you do that, it's like you've done it to me.
Isn't that? Oh, that really is so true. And I have felt that way talking to people sometimes. And I kind of tell them that, even though it's like, you could be Jesus and I'm talking to you. And they go like, they never thought of themselves as, we, not that we're Jesus, but it helps them realize their value. But you're right. That's what we're coming back. We're seeing this Jesusness, this Christliness in everyone, and then you want to minister to them. You can't help it.
Well, James, you have given us some amazing things to think about and ponder. And, I challenge anybody, if your interest has been piqued in any kind of prison or jail ministry, to check that out wherever you're living. Definitely check out the things that James has to offer. Look at his podcast. I'm going to have links to everything in the show notes. So check those out and go visit and listen to some more wisdom from James Early. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you. And I just want to say, if your listeners decide to subscribe to the podcast, you will get a prayer guide that I put together called Praying with the Mindset of Jesus. It's about a 3-page PDF, and they're just a bunch of Bible verses to think about how he looked at things, how he saw things, and people have found it really helpful just as a jumping off point to make that shift to the Jesus mindset. So I hope you'll find that helpful.
An offer that we cannot refuse. So everybody check out the links and go sign up so that you can have that. Thanks again, and hopefully we will keep in touch and talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, Lori. It's really an honor to be here, and I just appreciate all the good work you're doing, helping people discover who they really are spiritually. I mean, that's just a beautiful thing, and I think you're probably doing a lot more than you realize you are.
Oh gosh, well, I hope so. I'm glad we could join forces.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, I will see everybody next week. Bye, James.
Bye-bye.
The Unlovely Truth is written and produced by me, Lori Morrison. Music is by Neocortex, and artwork is by Shelby Highland. Don't forget, check out those show notes for links to helpful resources, and please follow me on social media. See you all next time.